Good evening. My name is Ganit Kori, and I am the Henry and Lois Foster Director and Chief Curator of the Rose Art Museum and Professor of Fine Arts and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Brandeis University. I am delighted to welcome all of you to tonight's program featuring the brilliant artist Catherine Opie in conversation with our very own Professor Tom King. This program is held in conjunction with the exhibition Face to Face, Portraits of Self and Others, which I co-curated with my esteemed colleague, Chad Sirois, Rose Associate Director of Marketing and Communications. The show is on view at the Rose through December 29th, and we urge you to come and see it in person, especially Catherine's amazing Polaroids, which you will see via Zoom, but on the screen, but it's not the same. The show, I would also like to thank Joan and Michael Sulkey for generously donating the two monumental Catherine Opie Polaroids on view in the exhibition, and which are the focus of tonight's conversation. We also thank the Sulkeys for supporting this program. Before we begin, I'd like to note that some of the images we will share are provocative and include depictions of body modification, cutting, piercing, sadomasochism, nudity, and trauma. The Rose exhibits diverse artworks that highlight the full spectrum of human experience: joy, pain, suffering, and desire. And we hope by doing this, we foster empathy and understanding and bring us all in community with one another. So now, Chad and I have the honor to briefly introduce the exhibition and our two speakers. Chad, can you start us off by saying a few words about our show?
Thank you, Ganit. I'd be happy to. Face to Face, Portraits of Self and Others highlights a stunning array of photographic portraits drawn almost exclusively from the museum's permanent collection. The exhibition features over a century of work produced by a diverse, multi-generational group of artists from around the globe. We are honored to welcome one of those artists featured in the show tonight. Catherine Opie is an artist who expands boundaries and broadens our understanding of what art can be. She is renowned for her powerful explorations of identity, community, and the American landscape. Opie has gained widespread recognition for her poignant portraits of LGBTQ+ individuals and subcultures, blending intimacy with bold formalism. Her work spans themes of family, belonging, and social structures, often juxtaposing urban and suburban environments with personal narratives. A professor at UCLA and a recipient of numerous accolades, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, Opie continues to shape the photographic medium with her thought-provoking and deeply human imagery. Her work is in numerous international public and private collections, including Chicago's Art Institute, the Guggenheim, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the Museum of Modern Art, London's National Portrait Gallery, the Tate Modern, the Walker Art Center, and of course, the Rose Art Museum at Brandeis University, just to name a few.
And we could think of no better person to engage in conversation with Catherine tonight than our very own Dr. Tom King, an associate professor of English here at Brandeis University. King offers courses in theater and performance studies, queer and gender studies, and early modern literature. He is active in the interdisciplinary program Creativity, the Arts, and Social Transformation, CAST, and was a founder of the program on sexuality and queer studies. His two-volume study titled The Gendering of Men, 1660 to 1750, investigates the political and performative struggles that produced both normative and queer masculinities in the 17th and 18th centuries. More recently, Tom has been working toward justice for all life forms as a community-engaged theater artist with climate change theater action and the Artists Theater here in Boston. So welcome, Catherine, and Tom. We are thrilled and grateful to host you here at the Rose.
Mm. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much for having us.
Thank you, Gadid, and thanks, Chad, for those wonderful introductions. And Catherine, it's such a delight to be in conversation with you. I'm really looking forward to this. And before we start diving into depth into the two portraits of the performance artist Ron Athey that we're seeing here on the left in the installation view at the Rose Art Museum, I thought I'd say something about the context of this exhibition, which is asking us to think about photography and the image in relationship to issues of personal and social identity, social belonging. Artists are both reflecting on the importance of visuality, the importance of the photograph, to representing citizenship, to engaging with the dynamics of belonging. And then they're also thinking about what it means to be asked to be legible in terms that belong to the dominant group. Whether that dominant group be the dominant white male Christian heterosexual class, whether it be the art gallery, what does it mean to have to represent oneself for the dominant group? So thinking both about the need for recognition and to make one's identity visible and legible, but also thinking about who gets to control the terms of that. And so with that quick introduction, I wanted to, Catherine, to hear your thoughts. I know you have often placed yourself within the tradition of social documentary photography, and that issues around visibility for marginalized groups have been very important to you. So let's just start off by hearing your thoughts about that.
Yeah, no, thanks, Tom. Absolutely. I think that one of the things that was an early mantra of mine, and it goes back to, I picked up a camera when I was a kid, and in a certain way, even the first self-portrait I've made when I was 9 of flexing muscles, looking like a baby butch, began kind of identity marker. Now, when I did that, did I know that I was making a baby butch portrait? Absolutely not. But that's the love of photography in a certain way. And one of the things that you were saying, I think is really interesting is like the notion of how we think about portraiture, or how we think about identity, and how identity can be constructed, identity can be found, and identity can be lived in very different ways. But what does that mean around a field of representation in relationship to portraiture? And I've always said that, there is no visibility without representation. So starting with that as a place marker of then correcting in my mind a photo history, because all of us queers over the years has played that game, of like, oh, they're holding hands in this like turn of the century portrait. Are they sisters or are they lovers, And so I think that there's this relationship always that we're always trying to find ourselves within other portraits, and what it is in terms of belonging and the notion of community that goes beyond kind of a Christian nationalist notion of community as we live in today in America, but what it is then to find our own tribe in a certain way. But the most important thing is in the relationship to a visual history for me.
Yeah.
And creating that.
That's so important. And as you're talking, I'm thinking about how for many of us we are very concerned about the possibility of democracy in the coming years. And so I feel that what you're saying is becoming again so crucial for so many of us as we see, particularly for the trans community, for our trans friends, this possibility of self-representation being taken away. You just mentioned the photographic history of representation, and this provides an opportunity to link your photographs, which we'll be talking about in much more detail in a moment, but to link those photographs to another image currently on display at the gallery, and this is Lewis
Yeah,
Hines,
fine.
LSI, and who from 1905, and I know you really have talked many times about your relationship to Lewis Hine. So could you please share some of that with our audience today?
No, I am somebody who is dyslexic. I'm a great reader. I'm not a good audio. I'm more auditory dyslexia, but I had to write a book report about it was from my social studies book, and I had to write about child labor laws in America. And it was like I was, 8.5, 9 years old. I don't know why we're writing a book report. I'm sure it was a really easy prompt at that point, or maybe education was better. Who knows?
I did the same thing, so I'm with you on that, Catherine.
But I wrote about this image of a girl working in a factory that Lewis Hine made of a South Carolina mill. And my dad owned a factory in Ohio. And I would go on the weekends to this factory. And I think that photograph hit me so much when I was a kid because I imagined my own body working all day in my dad's factory. And I went home after writing this report and told my parents that I wanted a camera for my birthday because I want to be a photographer like Lewis Hine. I want to be a social documentary photographer, and I want to change laws in America by making images. And I did get a camera on my 9th birthday. I mentioned that early portrait I made that, that Fiden printed in a book recently. But it was, I pretty much just started documenting my neighborhood of Sandusky, Ohio, which included myself and my friends and everything else. And then that's pretty much been the mandate for the rest of my life, which is really odd.
Not odd at all. I mean, Lewis Hine was also interested in using photography to change laws, and that you picked that up has been so powerful. And I'm when I look at this image on display at the Rose, I'm really struck by Lewis Hine's aspiration to give a kind of monumental iconography to this immigrant family. We both recognize the immigrant family as other, but they're cast under this Baroque arch, this monumental Baroque arch, giving them a kind of halo effect, or representing them in the terms of the grand tradition of high art. And at the same time, it strikes me that this is also a representation of the monumental scale of the infrastructure of processing the immigrant family.
And it's so interesting to look at this image now, Tom, because the time that we're living in around migration as well, that we now talk about immigration as migration, that we have changed our language in a certain way in relationship to understanding the political strifes within the world, and that this country is now no longer going to represent what Hine photographed, with the rhetoric of our current president-elect, is another reason why photography is so important in relationship to bearing witness.
So powerful, and I think that using the terms of high art here in order to do that is so important to what he was trying to do, and to what you do in your work. So if I could, I'd like to invite you to think about how you use the formal aspects of your camera to give beauty and to create this image of what we usually think of as the marginalized, the other, the unwelcome, but to relocate them within the terms of that we've received as the terms of the tradition of belonging, of value.
Yeah, and it is a simplification in some way on my part, where I've chosen aesthetic that is an aesthetic out of a history of painting, specifically Hans Holbein, and thinking about the kind of representation that he did of even, the court of in England, and the relationship to, being a royal painter. And so the idea of using that aesthetic then to talk about a community that is thought of as transgressive was a way to also take photography out of the location, so to speak, for me. So when I was looking at making the early portraits and starting with being and having and conceiving of that in the late 80s, you have to realize what was being held up in actually Congress was Jesse Helms holding Mapplethorpe photographs in relationship to the NEA and the support of arts and so forth, which we did watch an incredible shrinkage under that time period of Reagan and the moment of AIDS and what that was doing in terms of our community. I could have very easily gone the route of Larry Clark, Nan Golden, Wolfgang Tillman, Jack Pearson. The idea of photography still as observational, as personal, as all of those things were definitely the language that was being used in relationship to describing, the other or a notion of a transgressive community. I wanted to do the opposite. I wanted to make it all about the body, that the architecture was on the body, and to use color in a way to pop that body and to create the relationship of transgressiveness just within being. Just in the fact of a person sitting for a portrait is you're no longer looking around at the ephemera of their life. If I had done them in their bedrooms, then there would have been leather equipment hanging or this or that. And I wanted to strip it away where the body and the essence of the portrait and the formality is what began to speak to you. And by doing that, all of a sudden, does it lower your temperature in a certain way of your own assumptions of who you're looking at? And I really liked this as a strategy that I adopted. And it was definitely because of the artist Richard Hawkins, who I went to Cal Arts with. And he was the one who we were roommates, and he introduced me to Holbein. And we had started the portrait series together. And then he said, listen, these are yours and you go with it. So, but it was also out of collectivity and community, so important that these portraits were also made.
Yeah, you've said several things here that I think we'll be coming back to. One about Holbein and the lush color, as if we're seeing a Cavalier portrait from the 17th century, for example. So wonderful, and also about that these portraits aren't in isolation, that they open up into community. They become vehicles for the coalescence, the recreation of community. I wanted to linger here a bit on the installation view before we look at the photos close up. Again, just to think about the monumentality of the scale of these Polaroids. They're larger than life. They're 5% larger than life, I believe. I've heard made on the world's largest Polaroid camera. Could you talk a bit about why you wanted this monumentality, this scale, and what scale means for you in terms of these portraits?
Yeah. So I was chosen to do this with Ron so that Ron would be able to be an artist who's living with AIDS, have money in his pocket.
Right.
So there's a really, really special thing that went on. And this body of work was made in 2000. It was made in New York City. And it was made in between a 2-day blowing blizzard outside. And the camera is a fascinating camera. It is the largest Polaroid camera ever made. The lens is a fixed lens to a wall. In order to focus, you have to move the body in and out. I built a whole stage and a scaffolding system for these images, but you almost have to focus it with a loop on a vacuum form easel in order to understand it. So technically, I loved it. And what happened was the project for artists with AIDS came to me and said, hey, we know that you really we really understand that you're like a really special kind of technical geek about photography, and you can see that through all the different bodies of work that I'm really interested in the craft of photography, let's say. And so they said, we have this camera called the Moby camera. It's in New York. Would you consider doing a body of work of Ron Athey with it? So I met with Ron and I said, hey, Ron, you want to do this? And he said, yeah. And I said, let's do them where it's my style, but it's about your performance work. So let's merge our aesthetics together so that we end up describing what you're doing in different scenes on stage, but we're still using like fabrics that I would use. We're still using color seamless. We're still using kind of my aesthetic of portraiture, but it's going to be in action in relationship to what is driven with your characters and performance. There's a one moment that I break with that in a certain way, which is a nod to Mapplethorpe. So within this, then within all of the Polaroids, there are different nods to moments within the history of photography that happen as well, because I can't help myself in that. I don't know photography. But that basically was the premise. And then for 2 days, I worked with this camera, and then all the work was shown at in New York at Thread Waxing Gallery. And then the work was literally unique pieces that were sold that then allowed Ron to continue his practice as an artist. So it was completely voluntary of me as an artist to do it. But the challenge was, can I work with this camera? Can I do this? And also, it's a huge gift to somebody who's really important to me in the community, as a friend.
You had collaborated with Ron before and actually performed in some of his works as well. I hope maybe in a moment we'll hear a little bit about that.
Yeah, I did. I've bled for Ron Athey.
Okay.
I bled for Ron.
And and that this is going to get to something that even as we now look at these works, two things that you said that I will want to keep coming back to. One is the sort of collective nature of and collaborative nature of these performances, which push the body to limits. But also I was really intrigued by what you said about learning to work with the technology of this amazing camera, because it strikes me that so much of what Ron Athey is doing with body modification and in his performances is learning to work with the body as medium as well, and how can one sort of push the limits of the body in order to push the limits of the self, but always working on the tissues, the orifices, the structures of the body in the same way that another type of artist might work with their medium. I think at this point we probably should give a quick introduction to Ron Athey for
give a quick introduction.
our audience. Yes. So Ron Athey is a performance artist that has, as we're now seeing, has been working with the erotic, and particularly with acts that penetrate the orifices of the body or supplement the skin of the body, and through using techniques of tattooing, piercing, cutting, anal penetration, impalement, and forms of body modification that we will be seeing. And as I said, it really seems to be thinking of the surfaces of the body as extending out into the world through these practices of modification and supplementation. And on the one hand, Ron Athey has said he's working through his own personal history, his own personal traumas, but on the other hand, he is trying to stage something that becomes collective, that thinks about how these sort of shared and collective practices of pushing the body's limits can take us in unison toward a kind of ecstatic moment where the forms of identities that we have received can be worked through and on, shattered, transformed. So Ron had an early history in punk music with the band Premature Ejaculation. He in the late 80s began to move back into performance, including go-go dancing. In the early 90s, he became friends with the performance artist from Chicago named Larry Steger, who became a kind of mentor for Ron Athey. and brought Ron Athey to Chicago to perform at a French location called the Randolph Street Gallery, a performance called Martyrs and Saints. And this is at the time, Catherine, that you were saying that you were in 1990 we had Jesse Helms bringing the NEA4 to national attention, trying to push back against queer artists, queer and feminist artists who were using the body to make public statements of resistance to the norms of what it means to belong in America. And Ron Athey came to probably national attention most infamously in 1994 when the Walker Art Gallery in Minneapolis invited him to perform at a nearby venue, Patrick's Cabaret, and he performed 4 scenes in a harsh life. And this included a particular scene of putting. Yes, the human printing press, in which he cut an image, a design in the back of Divinity Fudge, Daryl Carlton, and then using sheets of paper, transferred the design from the back of Divinity Fudge onto sheets of paper, which were then suspended around the gallery, around the performance venue, and it was misrepresented as in a way that played into current panic about HIV and about HIV
very much
infected
so.
blood.
I mean, that's one of the reasons why I played with blood in my own work as a lesbian, was because of 1993 when I made self-portrait cutting on my back. That was a medium in which people feared blood, and also homophobia in relationship to like the idea that 2 women could live together and want a family or a house, right? So
Right.
it is like it's interesting because I think it's important to remember the hypocrisy of cultural notion of representation that Ron is playing with as well. There's an enormous amount of conversation to the hypocrisy in relationship to kind of Christian imagery, and yet if a queer uses it, then it's sacrilegious. It's like what how do we begin to think about those differentiations in terms of the symbolic?
Right. He is, if we think about his own Pentecostal upbringing, but as well as in larger terms about, I was raised Catholic, so I could speak from the experience of a Catholic, of someone who was asked to walk the Stations of the Cross and to work with images of Christ being flogged, of Christ being asked to carry his cross, of Christ falling, the crown of thorns, and so on, being bathed in the blood of Jesus. So these images inform and are being reworked, as you said.
Well, and the hypocrisy is that we don't enter the Vatican and we get trigger warnings. But meanwhile, we'll enter my work or Ron's work and we'll have trigger warnings, just as it did at the beginning of this talk, as we were warned about the imagery we would see. But we never get warned about, kind of the intensity and the violence of the imagery within the church as we go into these places. And I did a body of work on the Catholic Church recently at the Vatican, Walls, Windows, and Blood, which has a lot to do with that idea of hypocrisy and transparency within the Catholic Church.
Right, and you mentioned we were talking about the human printing press, and you mentioned that you did an image of that. So let's actually refer to that, because could you tell us, because here you make I think you're actually dealing with exactly these kinds of questions here in the way that you choose to stage that.
Say again, Tom, I'm sorry.
It seems like you're working with in terms of what you just said about the hypocrisy of what gets to be seen. In many ways, you've chosen to restage this scene from the human printing press in a way that seems to me to emphasize care
Well,
and
it would be
compassion.
exactly how Ron would have performed it on stage too. What I have is you have me all of a sudden, putting a colored seamless in the background. I really love in this image of the Polaroids. One of the beautiful things about this Polaroid camera is you don't have much depth of field for people who understand photography and technique. And so what you have is the absolute focus is on the cut and the hand, and then everything else starts like, slowly going out of focus in a certain way. And then there's these beautiful blood drips going down Daddy Daryl's ass onto the seamless. And you know, it is one of these, it is a scene out of that out of those series of performances. But what's really important about this image too is the history of mark making in terms of all of the performances that Daryl has done and accumulated on his back. A lot of people really have a hard time with this imagery, especially as a Black man in relationship to slavery and the idea of the marks on the body. There's so much interesting kind of conversation around that. What does it mean for a white man to be doing this? I think that all of those are actually really important contradictions in relationship to representation and history within American culture. And that Ron does tap into those on a very guttural level, in a very intense way. But, an image like this could have been easily constructed beforehand around identity, too, in relationship to thinking about Lorna Simpson's work or Glenn Ligon or what was happening in contemporary art around these ideas from, and one of the things that you have to understand is the consensuality of this, the relationship of what is consensual and what is known within, especially a leather community, is such an important dialogue versus harm on a body that is either, because of self-harm. By the way, most of these images are not self-harm, people. It's a different definition for self-harm. Please know the difference. These are performances done by queer artists that are within full acknowledgement of consensuality of creating these kind of marks on the body. And I think there's so much misunderstanding around it still within the world. Yeah.
I agree. And to add to what you've said, these are also positions that are transferable. Oftentimes, Ron Athey is the one who is performing the role of the human printing press and being cut by other performers in the scene. So it really does become about a shared and shareable exchange of positions here. But I also think that it does, as you say, performances such as these recognize the histories of inherited histories of violence and trauma that you've mentioned, including slavery, but also recognize that we can't step outside of those histories. We can't walk away from them. We have to keep working with them and through them, and so harnessing the anger, the fear, the abjection becomes a method for continuing to work on that history, and with that history as well, I think. Here.
Well, I think that one of the things, and I'm not saying this to create a double entendre in the language that we're using, but puncturing an idea of what is recognized within notions of norms of society and the kind of contradictions, and pointing out those contradictions is fortunately, what artists and writers and thinkers get to do. And that is partially, what both Ron and I, as contemporary living queers at the time that we grew up in, we were both born in 1961, just as you were, Tom. And there's a certain kind of interesting relationship, not only to the idea of what queer culture is at this different time periods that we are coming out in and living in, and our lives are living in terms of a politic, but it's also subtly really important to understand that that the contradiction is within the work itself because of the times that we're living in. And I think that that is often not talked about by the critics in different ways, that the notion that we are literally trying to have a larger conversation about identity in America as well.
Embedding the contradiction within the work of art, that strikes me as so important in what you just said, and to I'll come back now to the two images of Ron Athey here, because not only do we see those contradictions represented in your photography, but he is also playing with many of the sort of foundational contradictions that organize the way we think about reality, about truth, about meaning, differences between high and low, between the filthy and the beautiful, between the reason and emotion, between masculinity and femininity, and so staging those contradictions in the work of art seems incredibly important. And of course, on the left here, we're seeing a documentation of his performance of the solar anus.
Yeah, and there's another image that goes with this image because it's actually a diptych, but you don't have it up at the museum, where then the next image is of the solar anus, and then in this show at thread waxing, it would be the anus being fisted.
Yes, and again, another act that often people have a knee-jerk reaction to see as an act of violence, but the care that goes into the act, the preparation, the mutual trust, the consent, the giving over of the self to another is so important to fully understanding that process. Yeah, and also you mentioned that. You are collaborating with Ron in the sense that you're taking the action of his performances and then putting them into the action of your photograph in terms that make sense for you. I thought it would be useful just to as a reference point for our audience to understand that when at least in some of the performances of Solar Anus, Ron himself had already filmed the tattooing of his anus, and that this then is broadcast or is streamed behind him. So we see both the action of the tattooing, the performance that goes into the tattooing, and then we see the completed product, the tattoo and performs on stage, the anus that performs on stage, including an act of when, again, playing with this relationship between high and low, beauty and filth, he pulls a stream of pearls slowly and exquisitely from his anus here. And that's also, this is a moment that you referred to earlier, that you also staged a little bit differently with a Robert Mapplethorpe reference. So
yeah, I wanted the Mapplethorpe reference of the self-portrait with a whip up the ass with Ron's pearls. I mean, the fact that Mapplethorpe died of AIDS, like Mapplethorpe's, ending images, his image with the, where he's out of focus as well, and the cane is in focus with the skull and what that self-portrait did. But that self-portrait whip on the ass is if you really know that in photography history, you'll know that I'm restaging this in some way with the arm and the gesture of it. Not identical to what Robert did, but definitely in conversation. And I really, really believe in artists in conversation with one another, because that is a collectivity that is so important, And so when I'm in conversation with Holbein, it's not that I'm trying to make a Holbein at that time period, but I'm thinking about what that is at this time period to be in conversation with an artist like Holbein. And same as with the pearls with the whip,
And who could be represented in a Holbein portrait as well. When we if we come back again to these the two Polaroids that we have at the Rose, the portrait that folks will see on the right is a kind of assembled photograph of elements of other performance work, a character, a persona called the Trojan Whore.
The Trojan Whore, yes.
Yes. And here we could add several more elements to what we've talked about in relationship to Ron's work, in addition to engaging with the leather corset, the black stockings. There are black platform stiletto heel shoes here.
Well, the idea of femininity and beauty is always played with. Like here, there's nothing like living in LA in a facelift land, right? I mean, Ron is the first to just note all the work on anybody in any room. And so the relationship of him giving himself a facelift, pulling back is also, I feel like, it's a gesture from a California artist in noting, like what is contextualized around us in the landscape is, I think, also reflected within Ron's work.
Yes, he's used hooks to pierce his face in several places to pull and lifted it up with
lifted it up. He's given himself
right
a
into the crowd,
and he's basically surgically stapled his scrotum around his penis to create a vagina for himself. Yes,
what he has called the hatchet pussy.
Hatchet.
Yeah, and in performance, there is a very campy relationship to, I think, what you've talked about as he adjusts his makeup mirrors and proceeds very beautifully to lift his face in this way. He goes on to penetrate himself. I think we have some images here. He penetrates himself with dildos attached to the high-heeled shoes. This is a reference to another artist photographer, Pierre Molyneux, who had a lifelong fascination with his own fetish of women's stockings and shoes, and did many in the mid 20th century did photographs of penetrating himself with a dildo attached to his shoes. So again, just as you're saying, this inheritance, this legacy, reworking what's come before and making it speak to the present moment. And again, I think I see here a kind of queer resource of camp, that it sort of honors the taboo at the same time that it's transgressing it. It's reworking, it's honoring that history at the same time as it's reworking it too. And when we see these images in the Rose Art Gallery, we just have to say that given the scale of these images, we're brought face to face with Ron's anus, with the stapled scrotum. So we're really asked to look into that son in this way. And so that seems obviously a deliberate asset you have of audiences as well with your photographs.
Yeah, no, I think that, I mean, face to face is a very interesting way to think about it, because the scale of these isn't, you're face to face with very specific body parts, really, within the scale of these in terms of how they hang. But they are representational of a living, working, amazing, producing artist who and it is a response that is definitely in relationship to what I was doing with the early portrait work in the 90s. And I think that, when I made photographs of Ron early on, even, the 1992-93 portrait of him on green, before. And what I love about it, and why I talk about the queer body as a place of architecture, is because when you also look at a photograph I took of Ron here in 2000, or the latter one recently in the new portrait series, you see a changing landscape just as anybody is. And so also the idea of Ron giving himself a facelift, I think in 2000, he still looked pretty good. So what is that performance going to look like now? And does it comment to also aging in a different way, which is now he's a man living with AIDS who's been able to live this long as an artist, which was very unusual within our community. We lost most of our friends.
Yes.
And I think it's his ability for over 30 years to continue to do this performance work, such as my ability to do my work, is profound in terms of what we've been able to do within our community that has been put out in the world. And I think the important thing within the impact of that is not necessarily for ourselves and our own community and for Ron and I, for what we know, but for a generation of queers that are finding themselves in relationship to this. And especially, again, where the rhetoric has gone in terms of America. I was reading, about the potential secretary of the head of the Pentagon and his belief in normal men and the use of normal in his language. And so all of this is why the Rose has this up now as well, is the importance of face-to-face is not face-to-face in what we know, but face-to-face also in the acknowledgement of what tolerance means and humanity means. And I think that all of this is what we're reaching to, both of us, time and time again, with the work that we do, Ron and I.
And it seems so, thank you for that. It seems so important to me that everything you said also happens in a public space at a time when we're losing so much public space, so much of the opportunity to see identity as not something that I simply have on my social media account, but something that I take into space on behalf of others as well as myself. And that sort of giving over on behalf of others really seems crucial to me in terms of where Ron's work has increasingly gone over the years, as he's mentored more and more other performing artists, but also as he's brought all different types of performing bodies into these rituals and given them over to other people to perform. Again,
I mean, there's not too many mentors who train a cisgender straight man how to properly fist an anus with such care and love, and no, gotta appreciate it.
You have said that so well. I'm not, but I think that gets exactly at it. It is artwork. It is learning to use the tools to create this particular experience. And to make it something beyond the self that becomes shareable in that way. I was going to make a quick reference to an artwork that I love, of course, Saint Bernini's
Saint Teresa.
In Ecstasy, but the reason I thought I would include it is we usually only see the center image of the angel aiming its arrow at the breast of Saint Teresa, but we forget that Saint Teresa's ecstasy is actually public. It's surrounded in this setting by other statue groups, the patrons of the church, the audience members who witness her ecstasy, but there's also an inverse relationship, it's as if Saint Teresa needs that witness, that audience, in order to experience ecstasy in that way. I do want to come back. I'm going to skip ahead here. I do want to come back to the image that you staged after the Robert Mapplethorpe photograph. This is one reference to the work, but I'd love to hear your thoughts about what it would also mean to locate some of the references of this performance in relationship to feminist and lesbian feminist work at this time, such as Carolee Schneemann's famous interior scroll.
I think that's a really important thing, because one of the things that you have to remember that Ron surrounded himself with at this time in the community is that he's surrounded himself with, not only other straight artists that were doing work that were interested in tattooing culture, but also an enormous amount of dykes, such as Julie Tolentino doing his choreography, and Pigpen being a longtime member who I have photographed over the years.
Yes.
But that there is definitely, a really heavily driven bodily feminist language that Ron adopted and adapted to a certain extent in terms of gay male culture and queerness. That is really unusual because, as you know, I came out of the leather community and as a player in the early 80s. And then when AIDS came about, it was always separate. There was the leather dykes and then there were the leather fags, and we didn't hang out with each other. But during the height of AIDS and what happened, our community did come together in very different ways in relationship to, the kind of ideas of separatism that happened within our queer community.
Right.
And I think that Ron leaning into early kind of feminist performance work really gave his work more intention as well in terms of the language. And I think it's so important to think about Ron and being surrounded, as many men were at that time, by dykes, and what it meant for lesbians in the AIDS community, and in the massive amount of loss that we are going through, and the caring. And so many women in San Francisco were RNs who were going to houses to do,
That's right.
it's like. So the other thing is, you have to remember that Ron is using the materiality of what we were doing as people were dying of AIDS. We were going in and we were using needles to actually do IVs. We were like, literally, many of us were learning how to deal with emergency medicine because the system was so broken that we all had to take care of ourselves. So the notion of care and the idea of what you're seeing within the work and the idea of performance, and has so many complicated layers to the times that we lived through and continue to live through, actually.
Yes, and in many, I'm thinking as well as the constant presence of the latex gloves.
Yeah.
Before Ron pulls his face up into the lifted mask, he anoints his face with alcohol wipes, as if he's applying makeup, or perhaps he's Veronica cleansing the face of Jesus before the crucifixion. But so all of these material layers get pronounced in these scenes. I'm also, as you were speaking, I'm recalling that the scene in Chicago at the time that Larry Steger was mentoring Ron Athey was one in which Queer Nation had come to be in Chicago as a kind of anti-assimilationist movement,
Yeah.
rejecting, and the big hangout was a bar called Big Chicks, which was in Chicago at the time, which was off the beaten path. It was the place where all the drag queens, the leather folk, the trans community, the butch dykes, the
I remember
queer
Big Chick.
fags. Yeah, exactly. This is the place that we hung out, that we tried to make that world. But also, I'm thinking about, we had to learn, of course, how to have pleasure in an epidemic, and that so many of these acts of care are creating pleasure in the
Absolutely. Yeah. And what that is. Yeah. The consensuality is so important. I'm always so shocked at how my work is read, and that it sometimes like just misses the whole point. I have a self-portrait cutting up right now at the Whitney, and I made the mistake by looking at the Instagram comments, and I needed to immediately shut that down and not look at them anymore, because I was, it's there were people who came to my defense, but it's just ridiculous. It's like, oh, well, she's obviously mentally ill and she needs to be locked up. And then the next comment is like, well, obviously she's done quite well for herself, like, since she's made this in 1993, like. But again, it's just one of the things that I think is so important in entering any museum or looking at work is, I always ask myself, if I'm facing something that I'm not really sure about, like I ask myself a lot of questions about like, well, why? What are the artist's intentions? And if you just start asking yourself questions instead of filling yourself with your perception of what you think you're reading and that you're having some, repulsion to it or whatever, then you need to check it a little bit and ask yourself like, why? Where does this hit me in my body and why am I having these reactions to it? And beginning to understand also that that there's so many different ways of working with the body. And I always said, well, if somebody's going out, if all of these people are going out every day and getting plastic surgery and then hiding away for weeks at a time in relationship to modification, why isn't that transgressive as well? Like, how do we make certain things into being transgressive? And I think that we just have to reevaluate our position of what the body is and our relationship to it so often. And it's out of these like hypocritical notions around like some, notion of how to live a just life under religion that I just am having such trouble with these days.
I hear you, and I share that, and I want to give compassion to you of that as well at this moment. This you mentioned earlier in this conversation that in many ways this image was about at the time was about longing for you to have the things that you couldn't have at this time, that queer folks couldn't have at this time. The relationship, the house, the beautiful pastoral setting in which one can live. Later, you created another portrait, which I think we should celebrate here. Um, Speaking of the body moving across time and the landscape of the body or the architecture of the body moving across time, tell us about this self-portrait of you nursing.
Well, I was right out. Oliver was about a year old, and I was still nursing him here. And I knew I wanted to make a self-portrait of me nursing Oliver. I wanted the Madonna and Child. I wanted Pervert on the chest to come out because that cutting that was done in 1994. I wanted to create something of a trilogy of a language that it would go from self-portrait cutting on my back to Pervert to this as three images that kind of held a trilogy in my life story in a way that was really important. And I think that self-portraits are a relationship to a performance of self and an idea around self and also a representation of self. All of those things are combined in my mind about what constitutes an idea around self-portraiture. And often artists do self-portraits as artists. You'll see Manet with an easel, or you'll see these identifiers as an artist. But for me, it was always the body politic. And being able to finally get pregnant and have a child and have the cutting on my back felt like a really good ending to the story in a certain way. And also we need other imageries to contradict the Madonna and Child to a certain extent, and that there is a course correction, so to speak, on this, but using again all of those art history tropes in a certain way to my advantage in my mind.
And you've investigated many ways of portraying queer relationships. I'm thinking of your domestic series.
Yeah, my domestic, yeah.
I don't have an image of that today, but this was a type of documentary photograph of going into the interiors of lesbian couples, their homes, sort of showing the ordinariness, the mundaneness, but also the beauty and the joy of lesbian relationship and there.
Yeah, and it's a course correction as well in terms of ideas of representation. There was a very important show that was done at MoMA at the time period in the 90s by Peter Galassi titled Pleasure and Terror and Domestic Comfort. And they were questioning like the idea of the nuclear family within the context of the photographers within the show. But then, in ideas of Tina Barney and how she photographs her kind of, wealthier kind of blue blood Connecticut family. I was playing with actually having a conversation with Tina Barney and using an 810 camera in the same way that Sally Mann or other photographers, Gregory Crutzen of the time, were using that technology or that equipment to create a specific type of image. So I decided to buy an RV and travel around the country for 3.5 months, going to lesbian bars and towns where I knew people, and then creating this body of work of titled Domestic, which was in a way like, yeah, again, like without representation. I'm actually in a house right now in New York of one of the people that I did a domestic portrait of early on, Kim and Juliet. And we remained friends through the years, and they happen to be out of town, so they lent me their gorgeous apartment in New York to stay in. But that is also, I love it because in their house are all of their family pictures over the years that I've taken, because I did their first domestic portrait and then I kept doing it through the years as their family grew and changed. And I'll have to say that, in the same way Ron's body changes with tattoos or movement, that by kind of keeping up with that or that history feels to me in the same way as what people do around a family album. And why isn't my community as important as a family album? Or going back to the first MoMA show, The Family of Man, to a certain extent of what that created as also an identity for that institution.
As you're saying that, and this, as we are going to run out of time shortly, I'm thinking that maybe yes, I'm enjoying this so much. But given what you've just said, I'm thinking here. I'd like to think aloud with you about where are we with queerness now, and
That's
where
such
are
a
we?
good question.
Yeah.
We're not in a good place because but we're in a better place. So we don't know what's going to happen. Now, did the idea of going towards marriage equality, which is really argued about within our own community as something that was good to fight for or not, was that a good thing to fight for? And what did that do? Yes, it was a good thing to fight for. One is, I sound like Joe Biden, right? One. I've been watching too much television for the years of this year politically. But anyway, not to be all like a politician about it. But, I watched my friends' families who were homophobic come in and take everything away from a family member. And I think we both experienced that. And the only justification for me around that equality is that we are citizens who pay taxes as well, and we should have the same rights, period. Where is queer culture now? I am so happy to have the hugs of the teens out there. I'm so happy to continue to meet the students who saw my work at 5, 6 years old at the Guggenheim and now come up to me and go what that meant to them. I'm so happy that there is a different public platform than when I came out in 1980, what I miss to a certain extent is, how do we as queers continue to be part of a society and use our voices in any kind of radicality? And what will rights become for us? And what do we need to do to continue to protect our rights, but also to continue to be radical within our thinking and our processes? And I think we have a lot to readjust and to look at over the next coming years, especially under the Trump administration, because we're going to lose our rights. And there's going to be a lot of problems. And the biggest community of harm right now is going to be to the trans community. And we have to do all of our work. And as an elder queer, my plan is to work with the youth. I'm going to do Hotline again. I did rape hotline in the 80s, and I'm going back on trans hotline and queer youth hotline. And that's what I can do as an elder.
That's amazing. And thank you so much for sharing these stories with us, Catherine. And I'll turn it over to Gadit now.
Well, thank you both for this really riveting conversation. And I'm glad we get to see this beautiful, tender, alternative Madonna. here. I wonder if we can go to the last slide, Tom, because
Mhm.
uh, yeah,
Oh,
these
naturally
slides.
so. Yeah.
So we can end here where you actually see what you said at the beginning about turning to art history and being part of this genealogy of image making, but
Yeah.
broadening it to include those who had been marginalized or invisibilized. I think what I want to say, and so sorry that we have to go, but thank you, Catherine and Tom, for the conversation. But thank
Thank
you,
you.
Catherine, for your moving, important, and powerful work. Um, you can come to the Rose and see the face-to-face portraits of self and others in person until December 29th. And you really should, because standing in front of these works is very different than seeing it through your screens. So thanks, everyone, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Go to the Rose, support art.